program is provided without charge by Reformed Theological Seminary, which reserves all rights. To learn how you can support RTS, please visit give.rts.edu.
All right, let's jump into manuscripts in Christian book production. Okay, here's the next part of the course. Manuscript in Christian book production is part of what we're doing here. I don't want you to see this as a pure excursus. This is part of our defeater. We're going to do our defeater not only by noting the core here, but we're going to illumine this core by talking about how early Christian book production affirms it, okay, and corroborates stability in the development of the New Testament canon. And we're going to do that through a different lens. And here's what I want to sort of explain to you. When you study the canon, there's multiple ways to do it, but there's two main ways to explore the canon. One is the standard way, which is patristic citations. Church fathers saying things about books or quoting books is 99% of what people do when they discuss canon. What does the church father say about Romans? What does the church father say about John? What does the church father say about this? When did he say it, and what did he say? And how did he quote it? We've been doing a lot of that, and that's what most people do when it comes to studying canon. Nothing wrong with that. But there's a whole other avenue here, and this is what this section of the course is designed to be. Why do we feel like we can only explore canon on the basis of patristic citations when we actually have manuscripts that date to the 2nd century? Think about that for a moment. We actually have copies of these books from the 2nd century that actually have grouped books together in the same codex. Doesn't that tell us something about the canon? We also have copies of these books from the 2nd century that far outnumber a copies of other kinds of books. Doesn't that tell us something about what books were popular and what books weren't? So what I want you to see is that book production, text criticism, and manuscripts can actually illumine our understanding of canon in all kinds of interesting ways. Now, we tend to dismiss the manuscripts, which is why we did what we did this morning. My goal was to help garner an interest in you about the physical artifacts of manuscripts. We tend to think of manuscripts as sort of like disposable husks, and that we really just want to get the kernel on the inside. And the kernel on the inside is the text it holds. We don't really care about what held it, as long as we can get the text, right? So we look at our text now, and we're glad we got it. You know, maybe it's in our ESVs or however we want to think. We got the text of the Bible, translated in English, of course. We got the text of the Bible, and now that I got it, I can just take the husk, and I don't have to worry about the vehicle that transported them to me. Okay, whatever mechanism that God used to give me that text, who cares? You just kick it aside. I got the text. That's all that matters. Now, in one sense, it is all that matters, right? What matters to us is the Word of God, and that's fair and right. But what I want to show you is that the husks, if you will, the physical vehicle that carried those texts can also tell us a lot about the canon. And so this is where manuscripts and book production become very important for us when we think about the physicality of books in the ancient world. Now, this is particularly hard in our modern day to do because everyone now is, reading off a Kindle and off their phone. How many times you go to church and someone says, open your Bible, and everyone's pulling out their phone, right? And I'm guilty of this. I pull out my phone in church, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, I shouldn't be doing this. If nothing else, I should, as a New Testament scholar, I'm like, there should be some textualness, some physicality to the book. It's virtual reading, is almost quasi-Gnostic. Pick my phone up, throw it across the room, do away with it, right? Now I'm not suggesting it's evil to have a phone. What I am suggesting is because of that, we lose a little bit of the physicality of the Christian book. Okay, you hold it in your hand. In the ancient world, it can tell us a lot. So in this section of the course, I want to unpack some of that for you. And so we're going to go back to some of the things we talked about this morning on the computer screen. We're going to lay out some of these things so you can see how we can learn about the canon by understanding the physical artifacts left behind. So there's my little introduction to the importance of studying manuscripts. Let's move on to then some of the features I want to explore. And the first one is the quantity of manuscripts. What if we ask the question, what books were popular in early Christianity? How do we ascertain such a thing? If we ask the question, what books are popular, that can be very illuminating about the canon, right? Now, with caveats, remember the caveats? You can have a popular book that's not canonical, and you can have a book that's not hardly ever used and still is. Okay, fair enough. But leaving aside those caveats, still popularity of a book can tell you something about what Christians are reading. And we would want to know if it gels with what we believe. If we think this is a core canon and no one is actually copying these books, that would be a problem. Okay. So if we wanted to know what books were popular, how do we go about doing that? Well, one way is the way I already talked about. We could just see who's citing what. Okay, fair enough. But I want to do it a different way, and I want to do it by finding out how many manuscripts were left behind. So we're going to explore the quantity of manuscripts of different books and let that guide the popularity that the book must have had. And here's the rationale. The more copies of books left behind that we can find in the sands of Egypt, the more likely that book was well read and well copied and well used. In other words, the more copies exist, that means scribes have been interested in copying them, replicating them, and using them. So if we find a lot of copies of a book, that's suggestive that that book was pretty popular within early Christianity because it was used and copied numerous times over and over again. So the physical remains of books in the 2nd century tells us a lot. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to focus our energies just on the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This is maybe something you've never had a chance to do before. When people talk about the quantity of New Testament manuscripts, usually they give you the total, which goes all the way up to the 14th, really even the 15th century. And if we were talking about New Testament manuscripts total, we'd be up in the 5,700 range, okay, which is mind-boggling when you think about it. But we're not talking about the entire history of the Christian church up to the 15th century. We're talking about just 2 centuries, 2nd and 3rd century, okay? Because those are the centuries where the canon formation was most poignant that we're under discussion here. So what kind of quantity of manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? Well, as you can see there in your notes, we have over 60 copies of some fashion from New Testament books in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Most of our copies come from Matthew and John, with John proving to be the most popular. But we also have a lot of copies from places like Luke, Acts, Romans, Hebrews, and Revelation. These are extant manuscripts found in some sand pile somewhere that date to the 2nd or 3rd century as part of the New Testament. We have over 60 of these. Without a doubt, using this measurement tool, the most popular writing in early Christianity was the Gospel of John. Isn't that interesting? We have more copies of John from this time period than any other book. In fact, of the 60, 18 are from John. Remember, we're only talking about 2nd and 3rd century here. One of them you looked at today, P66. Matthew's not far behind. We have 12 manuscripts of Matthew from this time period. John being by far and away the most popular. Matthew kind of a close second, though. And this is really interesting as a guide to what Christians love. I suppose sometimes things just don't change in Christianity. I mean, if you were to ask people in the church today what's their favorite gospel, what are they going to say? John, right? Apparently he wrote a winner, right? Apparently everybody loves it. And it's popular then, popular now. And so, this is what the Gideons always give out. When they give out just one gospel, they give out, just John, which is great. Nothing wrong with that. But in the early church, apparently that was just the same. Now, I know that for y'all, 60 copies is not a number that means anything. But I got to tell you that that's a pretty impressive number for that kind of date. To have one copy within a couple centuries of the time the book was written is stunning. Okay, most documents just don't have that. You take about almost every document in antiquity that's that old, written in the 1st century, let's say. If we had a copy in 900 AD or 1000 AD, we'd be probably at par for the course if we got a copy that early. One. But what Christianity has is 60, all in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which is just unheard of. You have to realize that manuscripts just don't survive. Okay, they're hard to come by. They rot away, they're torn up, they wear out, they're lost, they're burned, armies steal them, people run over them with their chariots or whatever. They get caught up in wars. I mean, it's hard to have copies. So if you have a lot of copies of something, you have to realize that's just a smidgen of what must have been there. So you have to realize that when it comes to the Greco-Roman world, this is a lot of copies. Now, it's particularly put into sharp relief when you compare it to the New Testament Apocrypha. So let's talk about that for a moment. The New Testament Apocrypha is a reference to those writings outside the New Testament that look like New Testament writings that didn't make it in. Okay? New Testament Apocrypha, of course, are writings like the Gospel of Thomas or Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary. These are all apocryphal Gospels. So how about them? How many copies do we have of those? Now, this is really a telling thing, because what are critical scholars always telling us? They're always telling us that the apocryphal Gospels were just as popular as the canonical ones, or that apocryphal texts in general are just as popular as the canonical ones. And therefore, it was a total free-for-all, right? No core, just everyone's kind of open field. Remember, we're arguing there's a core here, which would have included Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as other New Testament books. Now, don't be thrown off by the word apocryphal, okay? I'm going to say this again. The word literally means hidden, but it's just a reference to these books. So the New Testament Apocrypha just means books like Thomas and Gospel of Peter and the Apocalypse of Peter and the Acts of Paul and so on, those kind of books. Don't confuse that with the Old Testament Apocrypha, which is the Roman Catholic books that are disputed between Protestants and Roman Catholics. So I know that's a word that has a lot of ubiquity to it, but just you have to understand what we mean by it here. So how many manuscripts of these do we have? We can see their notes. We have only 17. All of them put together, total of 17. So this includes the Gospel of Mary, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Gospel of Peter, and so on, for a total of 17 manuscripts. That means that we have more manuscripts of John alone than all apocryphal texts combined in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which is a really stunning fact. And the manuscripts, or rather the writing with the most copies in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, really 2nd and 3rd centuries, is the Gospel of Thomas with a total of 3. Thomas has 3 copies. John has 18 in the same span of time. And by the way, the Gospel of Thomas has 3 total in all of its history, incidentally, whereas John has probably well over 1,000. So that number comparison is absolutely stunning. Now, I suppose someone could say, well, look, how do we know that the extant remains of manuscripts are indicative of the popularity? How do we know it's just not random? How do we know it's just not random that we found more New Testament manuscripts than apocryphal manuscripts? How do we know that what we're finding is actually reflective of what was going on? This is especially relevant because most of the manuscripts that we have are just from one place, Egypt. So what if someone just said, well, look, all you're discovering is what was popular in Egypt, not what was popular across the board? Someone could make that argument. The problem, though, is that we know that circulation of manuscripts in the ancient world was incredibly robust, so much so that what you have in one place can be reliably thought about what you have in other places because of the way they were copied and transmitted and circulated and moved around the empire. And I could give you a list of examples of the way we know this in the ancient world. But the fact is that the manuscripts were sort of an information highway, and we have a lot of movement around. And so if there's good circulation, then what you pluck from one part of the empire is going to be representative of what you pluck from the rest of the empire, right? And the example I would give to you is like the blood in your body, you know? So imagine you go to the doctor and they want to draw blood to do some tests, right? And they draw blood. And then you object and say, well, hold on, how do you know the blood there is the same as the blood down here in my foot? Shouldn't you draw in multiple places? I mean, how do you know that you're just not getting a different kind of blood here and you get the tests are going to be off because you should draw blood down on my foot, maybe it's a different kind? He'd look at you and go, what are you talking about? You're like, well, but you know, I have blood all over my body. How do you know one part is representative of the whole? And he's going to give you a very simple answer, because your blood circulates. Okay? Since it moves all over your body, it's going to be representative of the whole. That's the analogy of what's going on with manuscripts in the ancient world. Because they move around all the time, picking one place like Egypt as representative is a good way to know what was popular. You may not know that, by the way, most of our manuscripts come from Egypt. This is just an interesting observation, and I think we all know why, because that's where the conditions were just right to preserve them. You're not going to find a lot of manuscripts in Europe because of the conditions, the humidity and the temperatures. It's got to be dry. It's got to be low humidity. It's got to be something that can be preserved in the sand for a long time. And this is why Egypt and Palestine and places like that tend to have most manuscripts. Side note, by the way, these numbers are always changing. We are always discovering new manuscripts almost every year. In some fashion, and lots of times they're coming from the same archaeological site. I mentioned in my other classes the archaeological site of Oxyrhynchus. Okay, Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. It's not a city now; it was a city then. A vibrant city in the early phases of Christianity. In the late 1800s, a couple archaeologists by the name of Grenfell and Hunt discovered what is effectively a garbage dump of manuscripts in the ancient city, really the lost city of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. Now, if you're an archaeologist in search of manuscripts, that's gold. So they found basically the city dumping ground where all the old manuscripts. Think about what you do with like your old newspapers or documents you don't need. Let's imagine you just dumped them in this big pit, right? and accumulates for generation after generation after generation, and then someone found it later. That's effectively what was found in Oxyrhynchus in the late 1800s. So many manuscripts, in fact, were found there that they're still working through them. The site is a live site over 100 years later. So here we are in 2016. I think the archaeological dig started there in like 1890s, and now they're still digging, still uncovering these manuscripts. And every few years they'll come out with a new volume of what's called the Oxyrhynchus papyri. I forget what the volume number is up to now, probably close to 80 or 90, I can't remember. But Oxyrhynchus papyri is this ongoing collection of volumes that document each of these manuscripts. And it's incredible how many have been found. What happens is they'll find a manuscript, but they don't have the expertise of someone that can analyze it. So there's this huge backlog of manuscripts to be analyzed. And usually, they don't really know what they've got in the list until someone gets a chance to look at it and identify it and date it, and then you find out what it is. So there's this lag time between when they find it versus when they publish it. So right now, who knows what's sitting in some box already found that we're waiting to have analyzed and published. But every so often, these things will come out, and there'll be a fragment of Luke or Acts or Romans or whatever have you, and it's just right there, the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Now, you're thinking, why don't I hear about that? Okay? Well, there's probably lots of reasons. One is you're probably not, a subscriber to the Oxyrhynchus volume papyri, and so, you're not getting that in the mail. You wouldn't anyway. It's extremely expensive. But there's another reason you don't hear about it, and that is because, for the most part, every New Testament manuscript that's found is pretty much like every other New Testament manuscript that's been found. Think about it for a moment. If you found a copy of, say, Luke that was radically different than the Luke we have now, do you think you would hear about that one? Absolutely. It'd be all over the news, but we don't. We find a little variant here, a little variant there, and it's just the same old song and dance, and everyone yawns and moves on. So it's not that exciting because the content isn't that different. But this is an ongoing thing. So the numbers are changing. In fact, today at some point, I'll probably pull up the Oxyrhynchus papyri website. I forget what the numbers are. They're in the 6,000s now in terms of manuscripts cataloged there. Maybe even higher than that. I can't keep up. The manuscript I did my PhD work on had a number from Oxyrhynchus. It was Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840. Okay. 840th manuscript discovered at Oxyrhynchus. What's interesting about it is this was discovered in 1905. So in 1905, they were already up to 840. Now they're well north of 5,000. I don't even know what it is. Now, again, these aren't all biblical manuscripts, mind you. Some of these are classical texts, literary texts. Some of these are letters. We have a ton of what's called documentary papyri in Oxyrhynchus, where we have people writing letters to each other. So you got receipts and bills of sale, and hey, I miss you and want to come see you. I'm going to travel on this date, and this sort of thing. All kinds of stuff like that. So you have all kinds of different material you find at Oxyrhynchus, but then mixed in all that occasionally is a New Testament manuscript. It's very interesting. So the numbers are changing, but for now, what you find is this great disparity between the copies of the New Testament and the copies of apocryphal works. So what are some implications we can draw from that? Well, you can see in your notes, I want to draw out two insights, if you will, from this. First, it reminds us that Christianity, and I've said this before, is a very bookish religion. It's very much interested in literary and textual issues. Christians were not interested in only oral tradition. They are interested in writings. And so they wanted to use them, they wanted to read them, and they wanted to copy them. And they did this apparently in great numbers. Now, when you and I hear the term bookish, in our world we're thinking, well, yeah, okay, fine, we knew that. That's no surprise. Christianity is a bookish religion. This may not be anything new to you or surprising to you. But you have to realize something. In the ancient world, this was unusual for religions. In the Greco-Roman world, it wasn't as if all these religions had religious texts that factored into their worship and factored into their daily life. In fact, on the contrary, it was really only Christianity and Judaism that did this. And you need to realize that this is one of the things that made Christianity really unique. I'm writing a book right now on Christianity in the 2nd century, and this is one of the points I make in the book, is that Christianity stood out from its Greco-Roman context precisely in this way, is that in religion, Christians were textually oriented. Now, people in the Greco-Roman world were textually oriented for other things, but really their religious activities weren't so much centered on texts. They were centered more on ritual. You go into a temple, you make an offering, you do this act or do this deed, do this ceremony, make this sacrifice. Now, there was some text that played a role in religion on some level. So we have examples of magical texts and papyri or spells. We do have other types of texts that occasionally are mention in a religious context, but not on the scale that Christianity used texts. Christianity was very textually oriented. What's interesting about this, then, is that people didn't really know what to do with Christianity as a religion in the earliest centuries for this reason. Think about it. If someone says, hey, we're a religion, you'd think, well, you're going to do what religions do. And what do religions do? They have a temple. Did Christians have a temple? No. What else did religions do? Well, they made offerings and elaborate sacrifices. Christians do that? No. What else was true of religions? Well, religions were usually associated with particular ethnic and national groups, right? So Jews had their own religion, and even the Romans had their religions. What about Christians? Were they isolated to one ethnic or geopolitical entity? No, they're all over the place. So they're breaking sort of misconceptions about religion all over. And then add to that Christians use texts in their religion vigorously. They learned them, they studied them, they memorized them, they taught from them. There's a vigorous intellectual component to Christianity because of these texts. Now, here's what that did in the earliest centuries of the faith, which is interesting, is that Christianity, to some extent, wasn't even viewed as a religion as a result. It was viewed more of a philosophy. If you read the Greco-Roman pagan critics of Christianity, they kind of don't know what to do with Christianity. They know it's a religion, but it's not normal, and it seems more like a philosophy. It's more like a philosophical school. And so what you have is certain philosophers speaking of Christianity like a philosophy, like a philosophical school. Now, this should tell you something about Christianity that you already know, particularly if you're in seminary. You ought to just let it sink in for a moment. And that is, there's a robust intellectual component to Christianity that is simply distinctive from many of the surrounding religious systems of its day. Christians were, in some ways, more like philosophers. They had a worldview. They had a system of thinking. They cared about how you thought. They cared about what you knew and understood. And so they were voracious users of texts as a result. Now, you could argue that, to some extent, that intellectual vigor maybe hasn't been maintained in modern Western American evangelical Christianity like we hope, right? I mean, when you look out at American Christianity, you may be a little discouraged, as I am, that it doesn't seem like it's so rigorous anymore. I don't know anybody who thinks of Christianity now as a philosophy in America. They think Christianity is quirky, weird religious people or, backwater people, but no one really thinks of it as a philosophy. But in the second century they did, and it largely had to do with the sort of focus on text that Christians had. Now, before we leave that, let me mention one other fact you may not know about as far as Christianity being a bookish religion, and that's an implication from the number of texts we see here. And that is that you may not realize that Christianity was a bookish religion in the midst of the fact that most Christians couldn't read. We don't know exactly what the literary rates were, or literacy rates, rather, were in the ancient world. There's all kinds of studies on this. William Harris in 1989 had a very famous study that sort of won the day and still is appealed to, and I think he's a little low on his estimates, but nonetheless, probably not that far off the mark. He says that the average literacy rate in the ancient world in this time period was somewhere between 10 and 15%. 1 of every 10 people was literate. And of course, the term literate is a vague term. It can mean all kinds of things, but usually in the sense that you can read and write. Most people they were literate in some limited fashion in the ancient world, so they could read but not write. So if you could do one of them, it would be easier to read than to write, and so on. But most believers weren't literate believers or were literate people. Now, in some sense, this sounds scandalous. Were all Christians a bunch of morons in the ancient world, right? Were they intellectually deficient? Were they the dregs of society and uneducated? Well, some critics would say that, but here's the thing. Having a literacy rate about 10% doesn't make Christianity unique. It makes it actually very normal. That's the same boat everybody was in. The reason some of the premier religions of the ancient world didn't have that rate of literacy in their religious system is because they weren't interested in having people in their religion from all walks of life. But Christianity was, right? Christianity was concerned to have people invited from all walks of life. Rich, poor, slave, free, male, female, educated, uneducated. It was for everybody, Jew and Greek. So here's a word I don't typically use much because of the way our culture has abused it, but early Christianity was radically inclusive, okay? Now, our culture uses that word, and what they mean is inclusive just means you never say anybody's wrong and everything goes. Of course, that's not what we mean by it. When we say Christianity was radically inclusive, what we mean is that it was a religion that was genuinely open to everyone. It wasn't true in the Greco-Roman Roman world for all their religious systems. So what did that mean? That means Christianity represented a basic swath of society at the time. It was a pretty fair representation of the highs and the lows. So the literacy rate would have been about 10%, even probably for the Christian world. Now let's think about that for a moment. So here you got a largely illiterate populace, but yet we're going to suggest that it's a bookish religion. How's that possible? So let's pause on that for a moment. I'm going to let you crack this. It's not hard to crack this little conundrum, but people assume that because Christians were mainly illiterate, they must have only concerned themselves with oral tradition. Kind of talked a little bit about this yesterday. But we're going to argue, and I have argued in other places, that actually Christianity being largely illiterate does not prevent them from being a bookish religion. How could that be, though? How can you maintain a textual bookish religion if you can't read? Yep.
Just one example is the typical synagogue and typical early church worship service was not mere ritual, but a lot of reading. Especially if they read from both Old Testament and then New Testament canonical books. That was like the norm, and then an exposition.
Yeah.
It's a very wordy worship service compared to just mere ritual. And so that's just one element of being people of the book in the early centuries.
Absolutely. So we go back to what we talked about yesterday, and that is the theme of public reading. When you studied the Bible in the ancient world, if you were an average Christian, say, in the Roman world in the 2nd century, you didn't probably even own a Bible. And if you did, you probably couldn't read it. So when you say you love the Word of God in the ancient world, you love the Word of God because you heard it read. Okay? And you heard it read a lot. And you heard it read at length. And when you heard it read, you learned and memorized it. Public reading was the major way that Christians learned and studied the Word in the ancient world. And so this was, by the way, there was a parallel to this in the Greco-Roman side of things. So leaving Christianity, just think about the Greco-Roman world, they would actually teach text to people this way too. Someone wanted to sort of publish a book, they'd have a public reading of it, right, as a recitatio, a sort of public performance of their book. And people would come and they would listen because most people couldn't read then in the Greco-Roman world either. And so Christians began to read their religious books, New Testament books, publicly a lot. Now, when you do reading now in your worship service, how long do you think, assuming you even have it in your worship service, I'm embarrassed, there's lots of people who don't do scripture reading other than the one right before the sermon, right? But how much time do you think we take in our worship service now for public reading? You want to give a guess?
5 or 10%.
Oh, that'd be good if it was 5 or 10%. Yeah. 2-3 minutes, maybe? Yeah, when you start reading it, what do people do? You can see their just eyes glaze over. They fade out. Now, in one sense, we can be forgiven for this because we're not in a culture that's used to learning like that, okay? So, to be fair, you have to be culturally conditioned to learn in a certain way. We're used to reading ourselves because we're a literate society. So when someone reads to us, we're like, But in the ancient world, reading aloud was sort of standard fare, and that's the way you would learn. This is an interesting discipline, learning to listen to people who read aloud. My family, I did this with my family years ago. We decided we were going to read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and we were going to read it aloud to the family. So what we did is we got the kids together, and this is when they were probably too young to read it anyway, but my wife too, and we had readings from Lord of the Rings at night. And so I'd read a chapter aloud, and it was almost like a performance, and then they would listen. And they loved it, and it created a whole new, it was a totally different experience than reading a book yourself. Totally different. Because if you can engage with someone else publicly reading and really engage and listen to it, suddenly you realize, wow, I'm kind of in this. It's sort of like a performance. I'm engaged in a way that maybe just picking up reading it doesn't do it for you. So you got to recalibrate the way you think about reading in the ancient world. Public reading was a big deal. In fact, there's a story in the early church. This is a little bit later than our time frame, probably around 4th century, of a bishop who writes to Jerome, who's an early church father, and says, hey, Jerome, this is in essence what he says, I used your new translation in Latin the other day in my church. In fact, your new translation in the text I was reading only changed one word, but it caused a near riot in my church. What this person had been doing is reading to his church so much that his church had memorized the text he was reading, and he decided to use a new translation. And Jerome, this was a Latin translation. Jerome's translation only changed one word. And the guy said, yeah, I read yours the other day. And he goes, literally, they had to call in, quote unquote, security to stop the church from basically revolting. Because they were so sure about the text they knew that when the guy changed the word, they kind of went ballistic over it. And the language in the letter that this guy writes to Jerome was, I about lost my church over this. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you pick your English translation carefully, right, here at in your church. But it also tells you, look how concerned these people were about the exact wording. They had it memorized, and they cared. And how'd they do that? Because of all the public reading. Now imagine in your church, you think if you did a public reading and changed the English translation, would anyone notice? Probably not. Most people wouldn't even care. They wouldn't even notice, but in the ancient world it mattered. Michael, you had a question earlier. I don't want to miss it.
Well, we were talking about the number of texts that existed from 2nd, 3rd century, and you were asking for reasons why that might be in reading as well.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, was that not the closest thing they had to the internet or email, too? I mean, it was transportable. It was a better way to spread those the word than
much more efficient.
Oral tradition. Is that a reason that they were also prolific?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, this was the main way you would get information in the ancient world is through public readings, whether religious or non-religious, right? If they had a declaration from the government saying, here's our new policy on something, they would read it publicly. So this was your way of thinking. So it was sort of the equivalent. You want news and information, you go to the web. They would go to hear a public reading. It was also a culture that didn't have the high levels of entertainment that ours do, right? I mean, when you think about what's entertaining to us, I mean, it's gotten so off the charts now that the idea of listening to someone read doesn't sound that interesting. But back to my story where I read Tolkien to my kids, actually that was paradoxically fascinating for them because it was almost sort of a retro-cultural move. They were like, this is so different than my normal life, I really like it, right? And so public reading was a major way that people learned a text. And so what that meant is that people could be textual even if they couldn't read, because their focus was a text even if they couldn't read it themselves, have access to it themselves. Now there's other ways that people learn text in the ancient world besides public reading. You'd learn it through the sermon too, to some extent. You'd also have catechetical instruction. There was no doubt there was catechesis in the early church where they would give you instruction and training and teaching, usually in preparation for baptism, was a big part of the way the church taught people. There's all kinds of different ways that you would learn, and if you couldn't read, that wasn't necessarily a hindrance to how you would learn things. So the quantity of manuscripts then here tells us a lot about the way Christians were as a culture. Okay, they were bookish. They were thought to be almost philosophical. They were textually oriented. They were people of the book. Okay, most of our congregations don't think of themselves this way. If you would think about kind of what is the major mark of Christianity today, they would probably say, well, who knows what they would say, depending on the church you're in. But, you know, what it means to be a Christian is to be someone who's about doing good things, maybe, or something like this. And no doubt that's part of it. I don't want to dismiss the ethical side of Christianity, or maybe not doing certain things, or being a certain way in your culture. But Christianity in the ancient world saw themselves very much as associated with this holy book. In this case, we're talking about its manifestation in the New Testament. Now, there's a second implication here from the quantity of texts. And this is obviously a big one where we're going. And that is, it tells us a lot about the relative popularity of apocryphal works versus canonical works. The sort of tiresome claim from modern scholarship that apocryphal works were as popular with early Christians as canonical ones, this does not fit that at all. In fact, on the contrary, this suggests that apocryphal works were fringe works that people maybe read from time to time in certain pockets, but did not enjoy the popularity or the widespread impact nearly as much as the canonical text. And remember, this is 2nd and 3rd century. This is before any so-called church councils made declarations. This is before Constantine could have done anything about it. This is before any coalescing of the churches around books. This is very early, and what do we see? Still this disparity between what was going on with apocryphal books and what was going on with canonical books. So this really, I think, is a challenge to the Walter Bauer heresy-orthodoxy claim. That heresy was just as popular as orthodoxy, and there really is no way to tell the difference. Well, apparently not. If you look at the popularity of these books, apparently there was a sense in which some books took on a higher role within early Christians as opposed to others. It's hard to know what to make of apocryphal books. We're going to do a little bit later. We're going to look at some apocryphal books in more detail. We don't always know what Christians thought of them when they read them. There's no doubt that some Christians probably thought they were scriptural, certain pockets. But there's also a sense in which some Christians may have just been entertained by some of these books and found them fascinating without necessarily deeming them to be scriptural. You know, this is particularly true with the apocryphal Acts. Acts of Paul and Thecla, Acts of John, Acts of Peter. These are all books that have this sort of adventure that people go on, and it's exciting. It's a lot of drama, and there's things that happen, and you listen to the story, and it's fun. You get to hear about how your apostles did this and that. How much did people really think that was true versus just entertaining? We don't know. Could have been sort of like a novel of some sort, kind of like the Left Behind series or something like this, right? Where it's like just Christian fiction. Of course, some people don't think the Left Behind series is all that fictional, but we don't know. But the point is, whatever they were doing with these books, they don't seem to be viewed in the same way, at least in terms of their popularity, as canonical books. So the numbers here, I think, are just a confirmation of what we're talking about. Now, that said, let me make one qualification. The numbers game, in terms of manuscripts, is a general guide to canon, but cannot be used absolutely. And here's what I mean. This is simply confirmatory of some other trends we've seen, but you can't just look at numbers and say that's the whole game. Why? Because there are some books that were clearly canonical that just weren't used much. And we don't have a lot of copies of them. You wouldn't therefore conclude they're not canonical. So remember, this isn't mathematics. This isn't saying, okay, we're just going to make our canon the books that we have the most of. Well, no, that's not what we're arguing. What we're arguing, though, is that generally speaking, the books that were the most popular were the books that made it in the canon, with some exceptions. What were some of those exceptions? I'll give you an example of an exception. The Gospel of Mark. Here's what's interesting, is that we don't have really any early copies of Mark before the 3rd century. Mark, apparently, was just not used that much. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think Mark just kind of was 3rd or 4th tier here in terms of popularity and interest? I mean, John's everywhere. Mark's down here. Does that mean people didn't think it was canonical? Not necessarily. TJ?
Significant portions of it are in Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. The honest truth is that Mark has, first of all, Mark's the smallest gospel, right? So there's less there for people to have an interest in. And then most of it, we talked about, 90% of it perhaps, is repeated in some fashion in Matthew and Luke. And this is part of the synoptic problem we cover in Gospels. In our world, we think, why not just have all of them? If I want a copy of the Gospels, then I'll just have 4. I'll have all 4, right? Well, that assumes that you have, a lot of resources to just get copies of Gospels, right? Like they're on the bookshelf. As if in the 2nd century you just walked into a bookstore and go, hey, give me that copy of the 4 full Gospel. I'm going to have all 4 of them, as if it's just sitting there. No, you got to go get these, and you probably can't afford many of them, and you could maybe only get 1 or 2. Which one are you going to commission a copy for? The one you like, right? Or the one you heard read, or what have you. And Mark just seems to be on the low end of the totem pole. So numbers can't tell you the whole story because we don't have that many of Mark. Here's another example of how numbers don't tell the whole story, and that is that some books that aren't in the canon we have a lot of copies of. An example of this, again, is the Shepherd of Hermas, which we've talked about numerous times, and I'll come back a little bit later to this. The Shepherd of Hermas, as I said before, is a sort of apocalyptic 2nd century text about a vision a person by the name of Hermas gets, and he gets it in the vision of an angel in the form of a shepherd, who helps him think about the future and different things. It was wildly popular with early Christians, and they copied it a good bit because they read it a good bit. So we have more copies of the Shepherd than we do of Mark. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that this whole analysis is irrelevant. What we're saying is that, generally speaking, numbers tell us something, okay? You can't just use it only. You have to use the rest of the argument, too. But this is confirmatory that, generally speaking, apocryphal texts did not have the popularity of canonical texts in the ancient world. We also know stories, of course, where in the ancient world, sadly, manuscripts were destroyed, sometimes unknowingly. There's the famous story that I've told my Gospels class about Tischendorf's visit to the monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. You probably know this story. This was late 1800s. Constantine von Tischendorf, there's a name for you. Tischendorf was a archaeologist, Indiana Jones type guy in the late 1800s who decided, I'm going to go out looking for biblical manuscripts. Can you imagine that being your goal? In other words, you're not just going out to find interesting things. He's like, I'm going to put a sort of team together, an archaeological crew, and we're going to scour the Middle East, and we're going to find manuscripts. This was his goal. It's very sort of Indiana Jones. So we're going through the Sinai Desert. This is a true story. They're going through the Sinai Desert, and they're looking for a place to stay, and they go to St. Catherine's Monastery, which is right at the basis of Mount Sinai, what we think is Mount Sinai. St. Catherine's is still there today. Very famous, one of the oldest monasteries in the world. And they have a very old library, as you can imagine. So Tischendorf and his team get in there, and they're sort of hunkering down for the night. It's cold winter, very cold in the desert. And Tischendorf says, hey, can I go down into your archives and look around? Because that's the whole point they're there for, right? So he goes down into the sort of basement thing to look around, and he gets down there, and he sees these monks burning old manuscripts. They are literally heating the monastery by plucking out old manuscripts from their archives that they don't want anymore or don't recognize, and they're throwing them in the fire. And he's like, what in the world? So he basically, tackles this guy, stops him, and turns out that in the pile he was about to burn turns out to be Codex Sinaiticus, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment, maybe now our most famous manuscript of all time. A 4th century complete New Testament. It's the only complete New Testament we have from that early period. And it's one of the most beautiful manuscripts. And what's crazy about it, he's like, I wonder how many they burned before I got here, right? How long have they been doing this? It's kind of like we probably run out of fuel out there in the desert. It's not like you can go down and chop down trees, right? So you probably end up breaking furniture up, and if you're cold, and throwing books in the fire. So, it's a crazy world out there for manuscripts. People throw them in garbage dumps. They burn them. The fact we have any at all is amazing when you think about how long the time is, a gap between then and now.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.